With the heavy rain outside, should I say still good morning? Good morning. Good morning. Of course, our good humor doesn't depend on the rain. As a matter of fact, we Filipinos, we love the rain. It's always a blessing as long as it doesn't flood too much. Especially, I was a student in UST from 77 to 86. And at that time, especially in the late 70s and early 80s, a little bit of rain, it always flooded. So that's why we always prayed for the flood, because there was no class, of course. You still remember even the bad things. But those are part of the memories of being in college or university. But dear brothers and sisters, we have covered 4 themes, 4 different angles from which we look at the Eucharist. First, we have the Eucharist as the mystery of faith. We have the Eucharist as the sacrifice of Christ. Then we look at the dignity of the Eucharist as a consequence of being this great mystery for us, that the sacrifice of Jesus has left us. And then in the evening, we reflected on the importance of Eucharistic adoration. We should remember that, the Eucharistic adoration is an expression, a manifestation of the internal growth, the spiritual growth of each one of the faithful and of the whole church in general, because the Eucharistic adoration, whether individually or done in community, is always a sign of spiritual growth. Today we will focus our meditation on Holy Communion. I was thinking of putting this meditation within the Mass, but we always, as almost like a tradition, that when it is a series of reflections, the last reflection is almost always related to Mary. So I would opt to put Mary and the Eucharist as our last meditation. So this, our second to the last meditation, we will meditate on Holy Communion. I would first of all cite John Paul II. I think this is a very beautiful passage in one of his writings on the Eucharist that kind of summarizes really what Holy Communion is all about. I quote him: "The saving efficacy of the sacrifice is fully realized when the Lord's body and blood are received in Holy Communion. The Eucharistic sacrifice is intrinsically directed to the inward union of the faithful with Christ through communion. The Eucharist is a true banquet in which Christ offers himself as nourishment. This is no metaphorical food, for he says, 'My flesh is food indeed, and my blood is drink indeed.'" End of quotation. Here again, only faith can convince us that the bread we receive in Holy Communion is flesh indeed, and the wine is blood indeed of the Lord. This reminds us of the series of miracles of the multiplication of the loaves and fish, which is really the pedagogy of Jesus on the Holy Eucharist. Let's say long before he instituted the Holy Eucharist on the Last Supper. This would be around 2 years before the institution of the Holy Eucharist. When, with all the people following him, he used the miracle of the multiplication of the loaves and fish as an introduction into the mystery of the Eucharist as his body and blood. This pedagogy is found in St. John alone, because it's really a series of discourses, and this is really a biblical setting. The gospel setting and explanation of the Eucharist long before the very institution of the Eucharist itself. So it gives us an idea that Jesus on the day, on a Thursday before the Passover, before the Holy Friday, that he just kind of had a brilliant idea. Okay, let's have this Last Supper, and then I will say that this is my body and this is my blood. I mean, as if sometimes we have these brilliant ideas that comes to us, and then, we get an inspiration at a certain point, a flash of lightning, or a flash of brilliance, or even a flash of pride. But Jesus, long before the institution of the Eucharist, gives us this teaching. It's a kind of advancing from the figure of the bread into his body and blood. I would like to, we might say, divide this, because there are several, the Gospels on the multiplication of the loaves and into the declaration of Jesus, I am the bread of life, takes place on 5 Sundays. And we are lucky that this year, these 5 Sundays were read. I mean, this is the cycle, because we know that there are 3 cycles of Sundays. And this year, cycle B is when this pedagogy on the Eucharist is read. That is from July to August. I would identify essentially 4 steps in this pedagogy of the Eucharist. The first step happens after the multiplication of the loaves and fish. You remember that Jesus asked, in the Bible again, it's very funny, because he said they just counted the men, not women and children. And then the Gospel said around 5,000 men, excluding women and children. So that's, just imagine, there are 5,000 men, and you can easily imagine at least 5,000 women and probably 15,000 children, etc. So we are talking really about a big crowd. It's like an Alabama LSU game last night. And I would say Notre Dame, yeah. Anyway, we won. These people had their fill of the loaves and fish of 7 loaves and 2 fish. Just imagine that. And this, if you have been to the Holy Land, imagine all these people sitting on that green hillside from the Church of the Beatitude up on the hill down to the Church of the Multiplication of the Loaves, Tabgha, down there at the edge of the northern edge of the Sea of Galilee. And then after this miracle, Jesus took the boat with his apostles in the direction to the northern side of the lake, that is the Decapolis. If you go there, take the bus, you could say that the Israelis are making miracles. They're growing bananas there and oranges. If you can still remember very well my last visit there, it was bananas in full bloom. You see bananas in the Philippines, we just leave them there to mature. The Israelites, when they have these banana plantations there, I saw many of the fruits were wrapped in blue, and many were wrapped in silver and some in gold. So I asked the guide, what does that mean? Of course, I had an idea already what this means, because you know that by silver you are accelerating the heat, because silver absorbs the heat, and the blue, I know that you are slowing down the heat, because the blue doesn't absorb the heat. So he said, yeah, this is because so that we could have every day a part is harvested and consumed or imported. And then that's why, those wrapped in silver, they will be the first ones to mature, etc., etc. But this is just, really a digression. That's already towards the River Jordan. And the oranges and the palms. The palms in Jerusalem, it was January when I visited. It was almost snowing. And the palms would die in the snow. Most of you are from Florida, you know that very well. So they were all wrapped in silver. Incredible. Anyway, so that part of the Lake of Nazareth and the northern part, the Decapolis side, these were the people were directed there. So when Jesus and his disciples in the boat arrived there, the people were already there. These thousands of people. And then they pretended to ask, oh, Master, when did you come here? I mean, it's like, and Jesus said, oh, I know why you are here. You are here because you had your fill of the loaves. This is kind of the first step in this pedagogy. Jesus, it's not, of course, bad to have our fill of the loaves. Even Jesus, by this saying, he wanted them to focus their attention not only on filling themselves with the loaves, which in itself is good, to satisfy, to satiate our hunger and quench our thirst. But Jesus wanted to bring them beyond that, to bring them beyond their bodily needs. There is another one that I would like to point out, which is a kind of a general theological or biblical information that you may remember, is that in the Gospel of St. John, the word miracle is never used. St. John uses the word sign. And that's why in this Gospel, Jesus told the crowd, I tell you, you are not here because you have seen the sign. That is the miracle of the multiplication of the loaf. You are just here because you wanted to satisfy your physical hunger. If you look at this decisive, of course, part of the gospel of the resurrection of Jesus, or if you look at the first miracle, the conversion, the changing of the water into wine. It could have been a miracle, all the same, changing wine into water, but but it's better to be water to wine, especially in a wedding banquet. And Jesus and the Gospel of St. John said, this is the first sign that Jesus performed in public. So, take note of that. The word sign in St. John is miracle. When St. John and St. Peter ran to the tomb, when Mary Magdalene announced to them that Jesus' body was not there, so they ran, and then St. John, being younger, got to the tomb first, and St. Peter was gasping for breath behind him because it's rather hilly. And then St. John, there is this very beautiful expression, St. John did not get into the tomb and waited for the Peter. It's a kind of a respect, not only of the elders, but above all of the authority of Peter among the apostles. And then when Peter got in and St. John looked into the tomb, and then he only saw the linens, and then he said that this was the sign. He said he saw and believed the sign. So it is important, it's the miracle, what this miracle in St. John is called a sign. That's why Jesus, in this gospel, in the multiplication of the loaves, I tell you, you are following me not because you have seen the sign. That is because you have witnessed the miracle. These people did not even realize that it was a miracle, but because you have your fill of the loaves. So Jesus already signaled this transition from, work. Yes, it's good to work for the food that satisfies, that satiates our physical hunger. But you should look beyond that. Start to work for the food for your spiritual being. That's the first step. And then the second step was when Jesus revealed himself as that spiritual food enduring to eternal life. He described how the Israelites had been fed miraculously with the manna in the desert during the 40 years of Exodus from Egypt to the Promised Land. And he said, I am the true bread come down from heaven. He said, your forefathers ate manna in the desert, and yet they died. That if you eat my flesh, which is true food, and my blood, which is true drink, you will have eternal life. Just as the living Father sent me, and I have life because of the Father, so also the one who feeds on me will have life because of me. So this is already the transition from the multiplication of the loaves into bringing them to consider something more spiritual, going beyond what their tasted, what their eyes saw, and what they were looking at. Jesus would describe that for us to live in this life and forever, we have to live of Him. We need to draw our life from Him. Sometimes we can think that this is an exaggeration because, again, it contradicts our experience. It contradicts what we see. We know that there are so many people who do not believe in the Eucharist, who do not believe in Jesus Christ even, and they are very well fed. And they are physically very well. And even Catholics who have abandoned the Eucharist, they are very well as well. But you have to look into the gospel, what Jesus means by this life. You know, as I've said, the Gospels, except Matthew, were written originally in Greek. Only Matthew used Aramaic to write the Gospel. In the Gospel of St. John, in Greek, there are two words for life. The first word of life is what is very common to us. That's what we learned from high school or even from elementary, biology, right? Bios in Greek means life. And that's why biology is the study of life, actually really just plants, because you have zoology for the other one. Now, St. John, in the original, did not use the word bios to refer to life in this discourse of Jesus. He used the other Greek word, zoe. That's Z-O-E. There are many people who call themselves zoe and yet doesn't know what it means. So you may have a baby or a grandchild, either call him zoe because it means life. But life in the spiritual sense of the word. Bios is biological life, that we are breathing, that our hearts are beating. But Zoe, that they use, the word that Jesus uses in this particular discourse, when he says, I have come that you may have life and have it to the full, Zoe is the word used here. And Zoe means a life, a spiritual life in communion with God. Life of communion with God. That is the literal meaning of Zoe. Zoe is really at the level of spirits. If all we have is bios, when we die, it's over. Just like the flower as the sunset that blooms in the morning and withers in the evening. But to have Zoe, to have life together with Jesus, then death is nothing other than a change of address, we might say. Nothing but a transformation. This is really what, when we say a Mass for the dead, on the first preface, it says that with death, life is not ended, but transformed. This is the Zoe. Jesus wants to give us this life in the discourse on the Eucharist. Life, and life that is without this connection with God, this Zoe would not exist. While bios is very good. We could have very good, healthy life, but it doesn't mean that we have Zoe, that we have life in communion with God. There is, of course, a parable which explains, which illustrates this Zoe very well. And that is the parable of the vine and the branches. What does Jesus say there? I am the vine, you are the branches. If the branch is not attached to the vine, it withers away and gets burned down on the side, just like when you are cleaning your garden or you are, cleaning your trees. So those vines which are not anymore branches which are not anymore attached to the trees or which are not anymore attached to the vine, they are put away and burned. But if you, the branches, are attached to the vine, who is Jesus, then you will live with him forever. You draw your life from the vine. You draw your life from Jesus. That is Zoe. So this is the second step in this pedagogy. So the first step is to draw attention away from the physical bread into the spiritual bread. From the physical hunger into spiritual hunger. Then the second step, Jesus says, I am this bread that can satisfy your spiritual hunger. I am this bread. I am this vine to whom you should attach, from whom you could draw life. The third step in the catechesis is when many of Jesus' listeners reacted to this proposition of Jesus. Among his many followers, they started to say, well, this teaching is very hard. We cannot accept it. Who can endure it? That's how the gospel says. So they started murmuring, and of course they started moving away from Jesus because they were not able to accept this proposition that he is the bread of life, that his body is food indeed, and his blood is drink indeed. And we see that many of the disciples, finding the teaching too hard to endure, therefore abandon him. It repeats itself, of course. It didn't happen. This is only really a kind of a paradigm on how the reaction to the Eucharist has always been down the centuries. This is only a paradigm. This is only a kind of a perfect example of how people of different times, of different races, react to the Eucharist. Now this is the third step. So the key here is for us to grasp that this teaching of Jesus is really hard. That's what I said at the very start. I also said that selling spiritual things like the Eucharist is very difficult. Even Jesus couldn't sell it. He had a difficult time. So that also must be taken into consideration. Then when we ourselves find it sometimes very hard, not only to believe, but also to go and participate in the Eucharist. Find time to participate in the Eucharist. Sometimes because it's very hard, sometimes we think it's not worth it. I think it's a very personal experience to each one of us, because they found this teaching to be hard, incomprehensible, and indeed impossible. Then they start believing and they start to abandon Jesus. Now the other reaction is the fourth step. Now Jesus alone with his apostles, with his disciples, turned to them. And Jesus asked them, are you also going to abandon me? We know very well the answer of Peter. Peter is always enterprising. Sometimes he makes mistakes, like denying Jesus 3 times. But, he repented. He asked for forgiveness. That's one thing. We are not perfect, not even Peter. And sometimes we fall. The problem is that, as we always say, the key thing is to be able to know how to get up again. That is Peter. With the crowing of the cocks, the roosters, he realized what he did and repented. That's also another paradigm of who repented and who did not. The one who repented, of course, maintained the calling of Jesus to be the rock of his church, while the other one did not repent and hang himself. I'm not saying that everybody who do not repent hang themselves. It's not. But it's even. If you this is again the mystery of our faith. I mean, look at Judas. Judas. I was talking yesterday about Felix Culpa. I saw somebody called Felix here. Oh yeah, over there. Felix, happy. That's a wonderful name, really. And even many of the early writers of the church, very reputable spiritual writers, that this was also a Felix Culpa. And that's why some even doubt that Judas really went to hell. Yeah, it is always a good thing to think about it, that there are instruments of the whole history of salvation, that many of them were completely imperfect. Look at the genealogy of Jesus that you read on the 17th of December, the first day of Simbang Gabi. Could you imagine that genealogy of Jesus there? There are prostitutes. There are non-Jewish. There are, of course, non-Jewish. Look at Ruth, the mother of Jesse. She is a Canaanite. And Tamar, who is a prostitute, etc. And there, everything there. is there. And if you look at there, how much Jesus, because of that history of salvation, entered into that history, that the Lord knows very well that we are not perfect. And that also, I think, that's part of our reflection of the whole history of our church. Look at today. I mean, there are so many scandals. And you know, more than the scandals of sins committed, even people think that's greater than those who did not do their duty to correct or to bring these crimes to the law, etc. So all these are certainly sufferings in the history of a church, any religion for that matter. There have been really tremendous periods, and it also in these tremendous periods were tremendous transformations. You know, really the point for us to make all the sufferings, even humiliations, is really also launching pads for renewal, for transformation, to be engaged, to be more committed. Because, I mean, you know, it's like today, I mean, you know, Jesus is something very, very difficult, and people found themselves in mental crisis of how to confront, how to accept or deny this very hard teaching of Jesus. And so they think, no, we'll dissociate ourselves from it. It's just too difficult for us. It's also like that when the church finds itself in such tremendous crisis or difficulties, and then we say, no, I'm going to abandon it because, you know, I don't like it anymore. But instead of saying, you know, I'm going to help clean it up, I'm going to help its renewal, that is really the best thing we could do. That's too much digression there. Yeah, but really I think it is very important for us at this moment in our history. Certainly we have been through even more difficult times, more difficult crises. Could you imagine in the Middle Ages, when the popes had children? Could you imagine? And yet we were able, the most difficult parts of the church. Look at the Inquisition. After the Inquisition, you know, there was this renewal, the rise of the most beautiful, the most effective religious congregations in the High Middle Ages, after what they call the Dark Age. The Middle Ages was really a kind of a dark age. And yet after that, the flowering of all this, the universities, the flowering of the missions. You know, some people don't accept Columbus Day. They even want to remove the Columbus statue at the Columbus Circle in New York, and the Italians immediately went to war. Let's keep it. And so de Blasio, who is half Italian, said, okay, let's have a committee. But anyway, it's still there, and they are not going to remove it. It's been decided. Very good, really. I agree with you. But, you know, these are moments, you know, I go to the Organization of American States debate, you know, the Organization of American States is the biggest political forum in the whole of the Americas, from the Tierra del Fuego up to the North Pole. All the countries are members except Cuba, who doesn't want to get in back because it was expelled. Now, every October 12, Columbus Day, there is a special debate. But many countries are completely denouncing the Columbus Day. They don't accept Columbus Day anymore. Bolivia, Nicaragua, Cuba, so many countries in the Caribbean, they say that it's an oppression. And yet I think it's really, how are we going to read history? I mean, there were certainly abuses at the time, and then it's not that Columbus came really with the intention to kill all the natives. I mean, and yet there were also so many achievements in the long period of history, especially from our point of view. Of course, colonizations have been negative in many respects, but we cannot change that, and we have to read history, I think, with a sobering, reflection on them, instead of completely just wholesale criticizing and rejecting everything that happened in history. That could also be really good for us also to reflect on our own history as a church. The history of the church is very interesting. It used to be one of my favorite subjects, but since I'm not teaching, I have forgotten it already. I still remember. But anyway, we are there. I mean, these 4 steps on this pedagogy of the Eucharist. So it ends up really 3rd and 4th with 2 diverging reactions to the offer of Jesus. It's like Jesus said, and it's like Jesus telling us the Holy Communion, my body is true food indeed, my blood is true drink indeed. And what's your reaction to that? So there are two reactions in the gospel that are indicated, and we believe with St. Peter that Jesus is indeed the bread of life. And that's, we should ask Jesus, give us this bread always. The biblical foundation for Holy Communion is what Christ himself did at the Last Supper. The actual receiving of communion. As narrated by St. Matthew, Jesus first offered the apostles what he was about to change, then changed the bread and wine, then gave them communion. St. Matthew narrates, and while they were at supper, Jesus took bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to his disciples and said, "Take you and eat. This is my body." And taking the chalice, he gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, "Drink you all of this, for this is my blood of the New Testament, which shall be shed for many unto remission of sins." So if we believe that the bread and wine are really the body and blood of the Lord, it is not because some theologians say so. It is not because the church says so. Not even because the popes say so, but because Jesus Christ himself says so. Clearly then, if we are to experience the Eucharist as the source and summit of all our life, then we must celebrate it with faith, receive it with reverence, and allow it to transform our minds and hearts so that we can truly grow in faith, hope, and charity. Of course, the saints are always our examples, and I could cite endless saints who reflected on receiving the Holy Communion. I would just give for us, for our edification and for our spiritual maturity, I'll just give some examples. I will give the example of St. John Vianney is the patron saint of the secular or diocesan clergy. St. John Vianney, when he was a seminarian, he was expelled several times, not because he was not a good person, but because he was not brilliant. His intellect was just low. He would not pass. He wouldn't pass the exam. He was a very good person. He was a very good boy. But the professor say he just doesn't get it, He always failed in exams, poor guy. And yet, with patience, he would go back, and then finally he was ordained. When he was ordained, he is one of the greatest confessors of all times, probably rivaling Padre Pio, also a great confessor. And he really kind of made a rural Paris bloom. I don't know if you have been to Ars near Lyon. You have been to Ars? Very good. Now there are still, his confessional box is still there. You can still see it. It's actually a wonderful diversion from Paris. After all the running around in Paris and you go to Ars, you really can sit down there in the backyard of the church or in front of the church and get some rest, recover some energy and have a good meditation about the spirituality of St. John Vianney. His feast is on August 4, so remember that, August 4. And he has this unforgettable image of the Holy Communion. He said, "Next to this sacrament, we are like someone who dies of hunger next to a river, just needing to bend the head down to drink. Or like a poor man next to a treasure chest, when all that is needed is to stretch out the hand. All we needed," he said, "to advance in the path to holiness and heaven was to come thirsty to the Mass, to receive the living water, and poor to receive the world's greatest treasure." He tried to get them to upgrade, so to speak, their faith from weekly communicants to daily communicants. He lamented how many good people remain merely good. He said, what a shame. If they communicated more often, they would be saints instead of just being good. That's really wonderful. You wouldn't think that he was dull. Of course, these are all products of his really great spiritual maturity. He said, Jesus tells us, everything you ask the Father in my name, he will give you. We would never have thought of asking God for his own Son. But what man couldn't say or conceive, what he never would have dared desire, God in his love has said, conceived, and executed. We would never have dared to say to God to have his Son die for us, to give us his body to eat, his blood to drink. Since all this is true, man cannot imagine the things that God will do. He went further in this design of love when we could have dreamed only. It's nice. It's a very good reflection. So St. John left so many jewels about Holy Communion and about the Holy Eucharist, but I would just make a last citation from him. When one makes a Holy Communion, one feels something extraordinary, a well-being which penetrates the whole body to the extremities. What is this well-being? He asked. It's our Lord who communicates himself to all the parts of our body and makes us tremble. We are so happy when we receive him in communion. We hide him in our heart and we bring him with us everywhere. I hope it's true to us. We hide him in our heart and we bring him wherever we go. So St. John Vianney's parishioners responded. It took him a long time and lots of tears to convert the people there, because when he arrived, nobody went to church. I just mentioned about a parish in Canada, in Quebec. This priest arrived there and practically nobody came to Mass on Sunday. He was, he was distraught, and then he started Eucharistic adoration, and just in a few years or even a few months, the church was filled up again on Sundays. St. John Vianney was going around the parish, going around the villages to convince them to go to Mass. And then in the end, the parishioners really responded very well. They learned from him that attending Mass is the greatest action they can do, because when St. John Vianney saw on Sundays people pushing their carts around just to earn more, or to have more food or something like that, and then St. John Vianney said, I really pity you. You are just working so hard for a bread that perishes. He was like Jesus. And eventually St. John really rejoiced that every morning, every day in his Mass, his parishioners came and received Holy Communion. We hope that all the pastors should be like that, right? Okay, tell your pastors about that. So the church constantly looks back to this example. I mean, every year when we celebrate St. John Vianney on August 4, the reading is always this. There are two things there, confession and the Eucharist. And it's every day, every year it is celebrated, especially for us from the secular or diocesan clergy. Of course, other saints are also like him or have imitated him. St. John Bosco, it's the same. St. John Paul II, who is really a great Eucharistic Pope. And St. John Paul II said that the church as a whole, and faithful Christians in particular, must live off the Eucharist. If we seek to be a good, faithful Catholic, he said, then we need to determine whether we are really living off Jesus in the Eucharist, whether Jesus is really the Alpha and the Omega of our life. But that begs the question, he said, what does it mean to live a truly Eucharistic life? Is it enough for us to be coming to Mass on Sunday and worthily receiving him? I think the easiest way to determine whether we are genuinely living off Jesus in the Eucharist is to determine what our reaction is when we do not receive him. Do you miss him? If we are truly living off Jesus, then it would follow that we would miss him, that we would really be uneasy on a Sunday if we don't go to church. If we think that we even feel better farther and farther away from Holy Communion, then that's a sign that you are not living off Jesus in the Eucharist. But the more you desire it, the more you feel uneasy when you don't receive him in the Eucharist, then that's a sign that you are indeed living of Jesus in the Eucharist. One illustration of those who live the Eucharistic life is often cited by Pope Benedict XVI, which I cited already yesterday. These Christians during the second century, it's really the first century, I think it was towards the end of the first century, in the 90s, there was this group of Christians in Abytinia. Abytinia now is Tunisia. You know that Northern Africa was really a flowering Christian communities there before the invasion of the Arabs, of the Muslims. And and it was also a flowering part of the Roman Empire, like Carthage, which is also now Tunisia. And these 49 Christians there were told not to go to Mass, not to celebrate Mass on Sunday. But as I've said, I will quote what, again, this is a very good name. Again, his name was Felix. His name was Octavius Felix. He was arrested with 49 other Christians. So the governor asked them, because they were defying the emperor's order not to celebrate the Mass. So Octavius Felix responded to the governor's envoy. He said, Sine Dominico non possumus, which is Latin for, without the Lord on Sunday, we cannot make it. They couldn't live without Jesus in the Eucharist, and they chose to die physically rather than suffer spiritually. That's almost a frightening example. We just hope that it would not arrive to us. What is important is that we could see non possumus sine dominica. We cannot make it without the Lord on Sunday, even without the fear of being killed by an emperor. That would be the best thing. And then lastly, Saint Teresa of the Child Jesus is one of the saints that I would recommend if you want to read deeper into the life of a saint. Saint Teresa of the Child Jesus is really a shining example, a very modern saint, and a saint that responds to a hunger in our times of humility, of acceptance, of she is the model of Mother Teresa, so very, very, very parallel. He said, you don't need to do extraordinary things to prove your love to Jesus even. You just have to do even the smallest thing with extraordinary love. And that is your greatest offering to Jesus. So Saint Teresa of the Child Jesus is really one of those great saints. If you haven't read her autobiography yet, then I would recommend it. She described her spiritual experience in receiving communion this way. Of course, she is very poetic, and she was very young. She was 14 when she entered the Carmelite order. So her poems are really characterized by the complete childlike attitude, a child's attitude to a parent, like this. So you can imagine how sweet her poems are, and it doesn't exclude his poetry on the Eucharist. On communion, he said, "At the time of Holy Communion, I sometimes picture my soul under the figure of a little child of 3 or 4 years who has got its hair, toes, and its clothes soiled. These misfortunes have befallen me in battling with souls. But very soon the Blessed Virgin hastens to my aid. Quickly she takes off my dirty little apron, smooths my hair, and adorns it with a pretty ribbon or simply with a little flower. And this suffices to render me pleasing and enables me to sit at the banquet of angels without blushing." That is a very poetic way of putting it. That indeed, when we approach Holy Communion, we have to be prepared to worthily receive it, straighten your hair, not necessarily literally, but it would be good also to look clean when you receive Holy Communion. But above all, our souls have to be straightened up, as Saint Teresa would have it. And there are other examples. I would conclude with Mother Teresa of Calcutta, because she is a figure that we know so well. She is the figure of our days. Mother Teresa, of course, had her daily example of profound devotion to the Eucharist with a 2-hour Eucharistic adoration in the morning. And this is an excerpt of her writings about the Eucharist. I will just read it and then we will end. We cannot separate our lives from the Eucharist. The moment we do, something breaks. People ask, where do the sisters get the joy and energy to do what they are doing? The Eucharist involves more than just receiving. It also involves satisfying the hunger of Christ. He says, come to me. He is hungry for souls. Nowhere does the Gospel say, go away, but always come to me. Our lives must be woven around the Eucharist. Ask Jesus to be with you, to work with you that you may be able to pray the work. You must really be sure that you have received Jesus. After that, you cannot give your tongue, your thoughts, your heart to bitterness. Put your sins in the chalice for the precious blood to wash away. One drop is capable of washing away all the sins of the world. When communicating with Christ in your heart, the partaking of living bread, remember that Our Lady must have felt when the Spirit overpowered her, and she who was full of grace became full with the body of Jesus. The Spirit was so strong in her that she immediately rose in haste to go and serve. Each Holy Communion, each breaking of the bread of life, each sharing should produce in us the same, for it is the same Jesus who came to Mary and was made flesh. We too should be in haste to give His life of Jesus to others. Amen. Amen. God bless you.